In today's episode, we'll be learning about some of the most impactful stories of resistance in the British Caribbean that you don't ever learn about in history books. Here's the untold stories the colonizers want you to never hear about. When people who were never victims of slavery write and discuss on the history of slavery and colonization, they often paint a picture of a people who, once they had crossed the Atlantic and survived the Middle Passage, they had simply accepted their fate. This narrative is so far removed from the history they want to be forgotten. When people talk about the end of slavery in the British Empire, the story usually begins in London. We're told about abolitionists, politicians, and parliamentary debates that eventually led to the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. Some British historians even want to credit the fight for freedom and civil rights in the United States as a direct result of the British deciding to end slavery. The moral superiority of the British on this topic truly baffles me. Welcome to Heritage Food Stories, Season 2, Episode 7, Stories of Resistance in the British Caribbean. I'm your host, Chef Mireille, culinary historian, food educator, and cultural storyteller with a lifelong passion for exploring global cuisines and the stories behind the food we eat. I preserve history, connect cultures, and inspire curiosity through food. Every dish tells a story, and it is my privilege to tell it. Before we get into today's episode, can you do me a favor? Please like, share, and subscribe. Join the conversation in the comments. It helps more people find this important history that deserves to be retold. Now, on to the main topic of today's episode. Granting freedom from slavery in the British colonies was not an act of altruism. Why did the British finally decide to abolish slavery after profiting from it for more than 200 years? Was it simply because politicians suddenly decided it was wrong? Or had something been happening across the Caribbean that made the system increasingly difficult to maintain? Because long before Parliament voted to abolish slavery, enslaved Africans throughout the British Caribbean had already been fighting for their freedom. Some escaped into mountains and forests where colonial governments couldn't reach them. Some organized in secret, knowing that if they were discovered, they would almost certainly be executed. Long before Parliament voted to abolish slavery, enslaved Africans throughout the British Caribbean had already been fighting for their freedom. Some escaped into mountains and forests where colonial governments couldn't reach them. Some organized in secret, knowing that if they were discovered, they would almost certainly lose their lives. Others openly took arms against one of the most powerful empires in the world. Not every rebellion succeeded. In fact, most of them were brutally crushed. But that's only part of the story because every revolt forced Britain to spend more soldiers, more money, and more resources protecting a system that depended on violence to survive. Every uprising reminded plantation owners that the people they enslaved had no intention of accepting slavery as their destiny, and every generation inspired the next. The story of abolition wasn't written only in Parliament. It was also written in the mountains of Jamaica, in the cane fields of Barbados, on the plantations of Antigua, in Demerara, and across the Caribbean, where ordinary men and women refused to believe that slavery would be the final chapter of their lives. Today, we're looking at some of the revolts that changed the British Caribbean forever, not because every rebellion was successful, but because together they changed history. Each rebellion brought the enslaved people that much closer to freedom. And I think the best place to begin is in Jamaica, high in the Blue Mountains, where a community of escaped enslaved Africans accomplished something almost unimaginable. They forced the British Empire to negotiate. To understand why Great Britain eventually abolished slavery, we have to begin with a simple truth. Enslaved people never accepted slavery quietly. There was resistance from the very beginning. Sometimes that resistance was small. It might mean working more slowly than expected, preserving African languages and traditions, or secretly helping someone escape. Other times, it meant leaving the plantation altogether. That's exactly what happened in Jamaica. Throughout the late 17th and early 18th centuries, groups of formerly enslaved Africans escaped into Jamaica's rugged interior. Deep within the Blue Mountains, they built communities that became known as the Maroons. These weren't temporary camps for people in hiding. They were permanent settlements. Families lived there. Crops were grown there. Children were raised there. Leaders were chosen there. The Maroons had created something extraordinary. They have built free communities in the middle of a slave colony. One of their most respected leaders was Queen Nanny. Although much of her early life remains a mystery, historians believe she was born among the Akan people of present-day Ghana before being captured and forced across the Atlantic. Like millions of other Africans, she arrived in the Caribbean in chains. Unlike many others, she escaped, and she never looked back. Queen Nanny became far more than a community leader. She became a military strategist. Now imagine you're a British soldier arriving in Jamaica in the early 1700s. You've trained for open battlefields. You know how to march in formation. You know how to fire your musket. But now you've been sent into steep mountains covered in thick forests where every path twists around cliffs, rivers, and dense vegetation. The people you're hunting know every inch of that landscape. You don't. The Maroons understood something the British never truly could. The mountains were their greatest weapon. Instead of fighting large battles, they relied on what we would now call guerrilla warfare. They attacked quickly, then disappeared into the forest before British soldiers could organize a response. When troops returned looking for them, they were gone. Communication was just as important. The Maroons used an instrument called the abeng, a horn traditionally made from a cow's horn, to send messages across long distances. One blast could warn nearby settlements that British troops were approaching. By the time soldiers arrived, entire communities had already moved to safety or prepared for battle. Year after year, Britain poured more soldiers and more money into trying to defeat the Maroons, and year after year, they failed. Think about that for a moment. The British Empire, one of the most powerful military forces in the world, couldn't defeat communities of formerly enslaved Africans fighting from the mountains of Jamaica. Eventually, Britain reached the conclusion it never expected to. It could not win. In 1739, British officials signed a peace treaty with the Windward Maroons, recognizing their freedom and granting them land. That's remarkable when you stop and think about it. The British didn't free the Maroons. The Maroons fought for their own freedom and won. Britain simply acknowledged the reality it could not control. That victory echoed far beyond Jamaica. News traveled throughout the Caribbean. People living under slavery on other islands now had proof that European armies were not invincible. Freedom wasn't just something to dream about. It was something people had already fought for and won. The British may have hoped that treaty would finally bring peace to Jamaica. Instead, it gave something else to the thousands still living in bondage across the island: hope. And hope can be a very powerful thing. Just over 20 years later, another uprising would shake Jamaica. This time, the fighting wouldn't happen in the mountains. It would begin on the plantations themselves. The peace treaty with the Maroons was a remarkable victory, but it didn't end slavery in Jamaica. Far from it. While the Maroons had secured their own freedom, tens of thousands of other Africans remained trapped on plantations across the island, working under brutal conditions every single day. Plantation owners may have convinced themselves that the treaty had brought stability. It hadn't. Beneath the surface, anger continued to grow. Many of the people forced to work on those plantations hadn't been born into slavery. They had been kings, soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, and community leaders in West Africa before they were captured and forced across the Atlantic. They hadn't forgotten who they were. One of those men was Tacky. Historians believe Tacky was a chief from the Fanti people of present-day Ghana before he was enslaved and brought to Jamaica. Although much of his early life has been lost to history, one thing is clear. He knew how to lead, and he had no intention of spending the rest of his life in chains. In April 1760, Tacky and a group of trusted followers put a carefully planned rebellion into action. This wasn't a spontaneous act of anger, it was organized. The rebels chose the Easter holiday to begin their uprising, believing plantation owners would be distracted and local defenses would be weaker. Before dawn, they attacked Fort Haldane on Jamaica's northeastern coast. The guards were caught by surprise, and the rebels seized muskets, gunpowder, and ammunition. Now they had something many enslaved people rarely had access to: weapons. The rebels moved from plantation to plantation, freeing enslaved workers and inviting them to join the fight. Within hours, the rebellion was spreading. Imagine being a plantation owner that morning, enjoying your cup of tea. Slowly, news begins arriving from neighboring estates. A fort has fallen. The enslaved people are armed and plantations are being abandoned. The rebellion is growing. It's starting to look like Jamaica just might slip out of British control. The colonial government quickly realized this wasn't an isolated uprising. It was time to organize. British troops were mobilized and local militias were activated. And then something happened that many people still find surprising today. The British asked the Maroons to help suppress the rebellion under the terms of the peace treaty they had signed years earlier. This part of history is a bit uncomfortable, but facts are facts. The same communities that had fought so hard for their own freedom now found themselves fighting with the colonizers against their own people also seeking freedom. With their assistance, Tacky was killed after several days of intense fighting. It didn't, however, squash the rebellion. Other leaders continued the fight across different parts of the island, and resistance continued for months. Although the British eventually regained control, the rebellion left a lasting mark on Jamaica. Plantations had been destroyed, lives had been lost, and perhaps most importantly, plantation owners realized just how fragile their power really was. On many estates, enslaved people outnumbered their owners many times over. If enough plantations joined forces in rebellion, there simply weren't enough soldiers to stop them all at once. That realization terrified the colonial government. They weren't willing yet to consider that this system maybe would not work forever. Instead, their fear caused them to enforce even harsher restrictions and punishments against the enslaved people. Despite these harsher laws, the British could not kill the goal of freedom Tacky had inspired, despite them killing him. His impact was still felt, not only in Jamaica, but throughout the Caribbean. People were beginning to imagine a different future. Across the Caribbean, ideas of resistance were forming and being acted on. Resistance and rebellion became a way of life in the British Caribbean. Every time colonial officials crushed one rebellion, another seemed to emerge somewhere else. Slavery wasn't failing because of one leader or the conditions of one island. It was failing because people on every island were not willing to sit complacently by. They wanted freedom. They deserved freedom as a human right. Across the British Caribbean, enslaved people were waiting for the first opportunity and then organizing and planning to challenge the system that had stolen their freedom. Some plans never made it beyond the planning stage. Others erupted into full-scale rebellions. Either way, they kept plantation owners living in constant fear. In Antigua, one of those unrealized rebellions was started by Prince Klaas, also called Court. He spent years secretly organizing what may have been one of the most ambitious conspiracies in Caribbean history. The plan was bold. During a public celebration attended by the governor, military officers, and many of the island's wealthiest plantation owners, hidden gunpowder would be detonated. At the same time, enslaved people across Antigua would rise together, seize control of the island, and establish a new government. Unfortunately, the plan was discovered before it could happen. Prince Klaas and many of his supporters were arrested and executed. The British believed those executions would discourage future resistance. Instead, they became another reminder of how determined people were to fight for their freedom. However, the rebellions in the Caribbean weren't always about freedom for the enslaved. One of the most famous rebellions, Fédon's rebellion in Grenada, was actually a class struggle. The French and the coloreds, people of mixed race, became frustrated with their rights being stripped under British rule and their not being able to practice their Roman Catholic faith. Pierre Fédon was married to a former slave. Therefore, his children were colored. This rebellion was started to win rights for the coloreds. In fact, Fédon owned many slaves who he only gave them their freedom the night before the rebellion so that they would fight alongside him. On March 2nd, 1795, Fédon's rebels launched an attack in present-day Grenville in St. Andrew's Parish. This was very vicious, and many people were massacred with cutlasses. Simultaneously, a corresponding rebellion took place in Charlottetown in St. John's Parish. 51 hostages were taken. On April 8th, 1795, a failed attempt to rescue the hostages by the British resulted in 48 of the hostages being shot to death. From March 1795 to June 1796, Fédon's rebels had control of most of the island except for St. John's Parish. By June 1796, the British had captured Post Royal and Pilot Hill, cutting off the supplies of the rebels. It would take an additional 15 months for them to capture all of the rebels, many of whom went into hiding in the mountains. After it was all over, 50 rebels were captured, 35 were found guilty of treason, and executed in what is today the open-air market in St. George's Parish. Their heads were put on display to deter any further rebellions. Fédon was never caught. Even today, no one knows exactly what happened to Fédon. Some believe he died trying to escape, while others believe he disappeared into the mountains and was never captured. His fate remains one of the Caribbean's greatest historical mysteries. By the early 1800s, the British had managed to suppress rebellion after rebellion across the Caribbean. On paper, it looked like the empire was firmly in control, but beneath the surface, plantation owners were living with a constant fear that another uprising could happen at any moment. No matter how many leaders were executed or how many rebellions were crushed, the desire for freedom never disappeared. It simply found new ways to express itself. One of the clearest examples of this came from Barbados. Today, Barbados is known for its white sand beaches, turquoise water, and luxury resorts. During the colonial period, however, it was Britain's most valuable sugar-producing colony. Sugar made plantation owners incredibly wealthy, but that wealth was built on the forced labor of tens of thousands of enslaved Africans who worked under brutal conditions. By 1816, frustration had reached a breaking point. The rebellion was led by a man named Bussa, an African-born ranger who was trusted with supervising other enslaved workers. Like many of the resistance leaders before him, Bussa did not act alone. Working alongside several other enslaved men and women, including figures such as Nancy Grigg, plans were quietly organized across plantations throughout the island. Working alongside several other enslaved men and women, plans were quietly organized across plantations throughout the island. At the time, rumors were spreading that the British government had approved reforms to improve the lives of enslaved people, but local plantation owners were refusing to implement them. Whether those rumors were entirely true is still debated by historians. What mattered was that many enslaved people believed their rights were deliberately being denied. After generations of exploitation, they had little reason to continue waiting. The rebellion began on Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1816. Thousands of enslaved people from more than 70 plantations joined the uprising. Plantation houses, sugar works, and cane fields were set on fire across large parts of the island. Unlike some earlier rebellions, the primary objective was not widespread killing. The rebels wanted to destroy the plantation system that had kept them enslaved and force meaningful change. The British responded quickly. Troops and local militias were mobilized to suppress the uprising. Within only a few days, the rebellion had been brought under control. Bussa was killed during the fighting, although the exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. Hundreds of other participants were executed, imprisoned, or transported from the island as punishment. Many were publicly hanged or whipped in an effort to discourage future acts of resistance. Although the rebellion was defeated militarily, it had consequences that reached far beyond Barbados. News of the uprising, along with reports of the brutal reprisals that followed, spread throughout Britain. Abolitionists used these events as further evidence that slavery could only be maintained through violence and fear. Each new rebellion made it increasingly difficult for supporters of slavery to argue that the system was stable, humane, or sustainable. For plantation owners across the Caribbean, Bussa's rebellion reinforced an uncomfortable reality. No matter how harsh the punishments became, enslaved people would continue to resist. The demand for freedom was not disappearing, it was getting stronger with each passing generation. The British still were not ready to abolish slavery, but the pressure continued to build. Only 7 years later, another major rebellion would erupt, this time in Demerara, in present-day Guyana. It would become one of the largest uprisings in the history of the British Caribbean and force even more uncomfortable questions about slavery, justice, and the future of the British Empire. Although Guyana is located on the northern coast of South America, Demerara was one of Britain's Caribbean colonies. Like the islands of the British West Indies, its economy depended almost entirely on enslaved African labor working on sugar plantations. By 1823, hope was beginning to spread across the colony. Rumors circulated that the British government had approved reforms. Some believed King George IV had already granted them greater freedoms, while others heard from Christian missionaries that changes were being discussed in England. Many enslaved people came to believe that local plantation owners were deliberately withholding those rights from them. Whether these rumors were true mattered less than what they represented. For the first time, many people believed freedom might actually be within reach. One of the men who inspired that hope was Kwamina, an enslaved carpenter and respected deacon in the London Missionary Society. Known for his strong Christian faith and calm leadership, Kwamina was not considered a revolutionary in the traditional sense. In fact, he initially hoped the dispute would be resolved peacefully. His son, Jack Gladstone, shared his father's desire for freedom, but believed stronger action might be necessary if the planters continued to refuse reform. Together, they helped organize what became one of the largest slave uprisings in the history of the British Caribbean. On August 18, 1823, an estimated 10,000 to 13,000 enslaved men and women from plantations across Demerara joined the rebellion. Unlike many earlier revolts, their goal was not widespread violence. Many of the plantation owners and managers were taken prisoner rather than killed. The rebels hoped to pressure the colonial government into recognizing what they believed were rights already granted by the British Crown. The colonial authorities had no intention of negotiating. Governor John Murray immediately declared martial law and ordered British troops and colonial militia to suppress the uprising. Within only a few days, the rebellion had been defeated. The military response was swift, violent, and brutal. Hundreds of enslaved people were killed during the fighting, while many others were captured, publicly flogged, or sentenced to death. Kwamina escaped into the bush after the rebellion collapsed, but was eventually tracked down by colonial forces and killed. His body was hung in chains beside a public road, where it remained on display for months as a warning to anyone who might consider rebellion. The uprising also claimed another victim whose death sparked outrage far beyond Guyana. John Smith, a British missionary with the London Missionary Society, had spent years teaching Christianity to the enslaved population. Although there was no evidence that he had planned or encouraged the rebellion, colonial officials accused him of failing to report it. Smith was arrested, convicted by a military court, and sentenced to death. Before his execution could take place, he died in prison from illness. News of what became known as the Demerara martyr spread quickly throughout Britain. Many people who had previously paid little attention to slavery were shocked that a Christian missionary had been sentenced to death simply for ministering to enslaved people. His death strengthened the abolitionist movement and increased public criticism of the colonial governments that defended slavery through violence and intimidation. The Demerara Rebellion may have been defeated, but it further exposed the instability of the plantation system. It showed that enslaved people were willing to organize on a massive scale and that maintaining slavery required constant military force. Each rebellion made it increasingly difficult for the British to defend slavery as either moral or practical. Just 8 years later, Jamaica would witness an even larger uprising led by a man whose name had become one of the most important in Caribbean history, Samuel Sharpe. His rebellion would become the final major turning point before slavery was abolished throughout most of the British Empire. By the early 1830s, Britain had already spent decades putting down slave rebellions across the Caribbean. From Jamaica to Barbados, Antigua to Demerara, colonial governments had relied on executions, harsher laws, and military force to preserve the plantation system. Yet resistance never disappeared. In Jamaica, tensions had reached a breaking point. The island remained Britain's most valuable Caribbean colony, producing enormous amounts of sugar through the labor of nearly 300,000 enslaved Africans. Although abolition was being debated in Parliament, very little had changed for those working on the plantations. Conditions remained harsh, punishments were severe, and many enslaved people had grown tired of waiting for promises of reform that never seemed to arrive. One of those people was Samuel Sharpe. Sharpe was an enslaved Baptist deacon who was respected throughout Western Jamaica for his intelligence, leadership, and deep Christian faith. Through his involvement with the Baptist Church, he had learned about growing anti-slavery movements in Britain. News that Parliament was discussing abolition spread across the island, leading many enslaved people to believe that freedom was coming and that the local plantation owners were deliberately withholding it. Unlike many earlier resistance leaders, Sharpe did not initially call for an armed rebellion. His plan was remarkably simple. He encouraged enslaved workers to stop working after Christmas in 1831 unless they were paid wages. It was intended to be a peaceful general strike that would demonstrate how completely the Jamaican economy depended on enslaved labor. Without workers harvesting sugarcane, the plantation system would grind to a halt. Thousands agreed to participate. However, as fear spread among plantation owners and colonial authorities, violence quickly escalated. Some estates were set on fire, and clashes broke out between enslaved people, militia forces, and British troops. What had begun as a peaceful labor protest became the largest slave uprising in the history of the British Caribbean, known as the Baptist War or the Christmas Rebellion. The uprising involved an estimated 60,000 enslaved men and women across western Jamaica. The British response was swift and devastating. Troops were deployed across the island, supported by local militia units. Within weeks, the rebellion had been crushed. Hundreds of enslaved people were killed during the fighting, while many others were executed afterward, even if they had not taken part in acts of violence. Entire communities were subjected to harsh reprisals designed to prevent any future uprising. Samuel Sharpe was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. On May 23rd, 1832, he was hung in Montego Bay. Although the rebellion was defeated militarily, its political impact was impossible to ignore. Reports of the uprising and Britain's brutal response filled newspapers. Members of Parliament questioned whether slavery could continue without constant bloodshed. Abolitionists pointed to Jamaica as proof that the system had become both morally indefensible and increasingly impossible to maintain. Just 1 year later, in 1833, Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act. The law officially abolished slavery throughout most of the British Empire, although many formerly enslaved people were forced into an unfair apprenticeship system before gaining full freedom in 1838. Samuel Sharpe did not live to see that victory, but his rebellion became one of the final and most powerful demonstrations that slavery could not survive forever. Like the resistance movements that came before it, the Baptist War reminded Britain that the people it sought to enslave would continue demanding freedom until they finally achieved it. Slavery was not abolished because the British suddenly decided it was morally wrong, but rather the futility of constantly fighting rebellion after rebellion, losing workers and money in the process. For more than a century, enslaved Africans across the Caribbean had challenged the plantation system in countless ways. Some escaped and established independent Maroon communities. Others organized conspiracies, launched rebellions, sabotaged plantations, or resisted in quieter ways that rarely appeared in official records. Every act of resistance made slavery more difficult and more expensive to maintain. The end of slavery resulted from many factors working together. Abolitionists in Britain campaigned for decades. Religious organizations condemned the institution, economic conditions began to change, and public opinion gradually shifted. But the resistance of enslaved people themselves was an essential part of that story. Their determination demonstrated that slavery could never be sustained without constant coercion and violence. Many of the leaders remembered today did not live to see slavery abolished. Even so, their actions shaped the history of the Caribbean and helped bring an end to one of the darkest chapters of the Americas. Their stories remind us that the fight against slavery did not begin in Parliament. It began on plantations, in mountain settlements, in churches, and in communities where ordinary men and women refused to accept that enslavement would define the rest of their lives. Now that we know who were the important people that led to emancipation in the British Caribbean, let's focus on the delicious foods that shaped the cuisine. These foods were created from the enslaved Africans who did the cooking on the plantations, combining African culinary techniques with the locally available ingredients they encountered in the Caribbean. Here are some of the most iconic dishes of the British Caribbean. Cuckoo. This is one part of the national dish of Barbados, cuckoo and flying fish. Cuckoo is a type of cornmeal mush that you will find in several Caribbean countries, with different variations and different names, like fungi in Antigua and turned cornmeal in Jamaica. This is essentially an evolution of African fufu, with cornmeal as the base. Kalaloo. Kalaloo and its variations throughout the Caribbean are all derived from the African traditions of okra soup and green leaf vegetables. The Jamaican version is made from a simple stir fry of amaranth leaves, while the version popular in most other islands combines okra, dasheen bush, taro leaves, and pumpkin, slow cooked and then pureed into a porridge like consistency. Ackee and saltfish is the national dish of Jamaica, but ackee is actually not considered an edible fruit in Africa and is generally used as a shady plant. Originating in Ghana, it was transported on British slave ships to be planted. It thrived and grew abundantly in Jamaica. Although it is largely overlooked as food in Africa, in Jamaica, where rations were limited, the African enslaved people turned to it as a cheap, abundant foodstuff in a brutal economic system that offered them little else, and it was eventually paired with imported salt cod. Jamaican jerk. While heavily influenced by the indigenous Taino people, the iconic jerk method was developed by the Maroons, escaped enslaved Africans in Jamaica's mountains. They used West African spice traditions and slow smoking techniques in underground pits to preserve meat and evade British captors. Learning how to cook to evade the British, this cooking technique was survival. Rice and peas is a Caribbean staple, derived from seasoned rice or dry rice. It is a derivative of the one pot cooking techniques from Africa. It reflects the West African practice of combining starches with legumes. When we sit down to a plate of ackee and saltfish or spoon callaloo over rice and peas, it's easy to see comfort food, but every ingredient on that plate carries the same story we just spent this episode telling. Ackee, dismissed as inedible in the land it came from, was transformed by enslaved hands into something life-sustaining because survival demanded it. Kuku and Kalalu carried African technique across an ocean and rebuilt themselves with whatever the Caribbean soil offered. Jerk was born in the same mountains where the Maroons outmaneuvered the British Empire, a cooking method invented quite literally to keep people alive and hidden while they fought for their freedom. That's the part of this history that too often gets left out. Resistance wasn't only fought with guns and fire, though there was plenty of that too. From Tacky's rebellion to Bussa's uprising to Samuel Sharpe's Baptist War, it was also fought in the kitchen. Every time an enslaved cook took a discarded fruit, a scrap ration, or a half-remembered technique from home and turned it into something nourishing, that was resistance. That was refusing to let the system define what was possible. The same ingenuity that built maroon strongholds in the Blue Mountains built ackee and saltfish in plantation kitchens. So when we talk about how slavery ended in the British Caribbean, we have to talk about all of it. The rebellions that cost the empire soldiers and money it couldn't keep spending, and the quieter daily acts of resistance that kept people and culture alive long enough to eventually win freedom. Queen Nanny, Tacky, Prince Klaas, Fédon, Bussa, Jack Gladstone, Samuel Sharpe. Their names deserve to be remembered, but so do the countless unnamed cooks who made sure that African identity survived the Middle Passage, survived the plantation, and is still on our plates today. That's what this podcast is really about: preserving history, connecting cultures, and inspiring curiosity through food. Food isn't just what fed the body, it's what preserved the memory, and it's still telling the story if we're willing to listen. Thanks for tuning in today. You'll find the full articles, free recipes, and related resources linked in the show notes. For more stories where food meets history and culture, subscribe to my Substack. For subscriber-only recipes and to support my work, consider upgrading to a paid subscription. You can also explore more than 1,000 recipes from all over the world on my website at globalkitchentravels.com. I'm Chef Mireille. See you in the next episode.